So I'm Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogues on How to Build a Cultures of Empathy. I've been starting to put the plural under cultures. And I'm here with Maria Ross. And Maria, as I understand it, you're the founder of Red Slice, a consultancy. You advise entrepreneurs and startups and fast growth-based businesses. And you're also a keynote speaker. And the reason we're chatting is you have just brought out this book last year, The Empathy Edge, Harnessing the Value of Compassion as an Engine for Success. And a little subtitle here is A Playbook for Brands, Leaders, and Teams. So we wanted to chat about that. Is there more you'd like to say by way of introducing yourself?
No, I think you covered it. I specialize in brand strategy and helping clients with their brand stories. And it's based in what's their authentic story, not what they're trying to pretend to be, but who they authentically are. And empathy oddly enough, grew out of that in talking to clients about empathy, wanting to be seen as empathetic. And it's like, well, it's one thing to want to be seen as empathetic, but what are you doing that is actually empathetic? And a variety of other factors that went into why I wrote this book, which we can talk about. But
okay.
Yeah, I've been doing that for about 12 years now. And have authored a few other books, but this is my biggest heart project to date.
Well, you've done a bunch of interviews, already, and I've seen them. There'll be links to your website and the interviews, in the description here. Mm-hmm. The area that I really wanted to focus on was, well, your book has 4 parts to it. There's, why businesses need to cultivate empathy, the empathic leader, the empathic culture, and the empathic brand. So those are, 4 parts to it. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to kind of focus on the empathic culture part of it,
Sure.
to kind of start with that part, because that's something I've been working on for the past 12, 13 years, as well, is mm-hmm. how do we create a more empathic society? And it's great, just this, hear you talking about, well, how do we create more empathic cultures in businesses? So
right.
I thought maybe we'd zoom in on that.
Yeah, that would be great.
So, okay. I had some questions here about the empathic, you call it the empathetic cultures,
yeah,
part 3.
That's by design, actually. Mm-hmm. I know that technically the grammatical term is empathic, but again, being empathetic towards my audience, being in many cases business people, business leaders, and especially since I wrote a book where I was trying to convince the skeptics with data and research, right? I knew the word empathic might put them off. And so I intentionally used the word empathetic, even though, again, it's probably more accurate to say empathic, but I thought they might think it was too woo-woo and wouldn't pick up the book. And the whole point is to try to reach these people where they are. So empathetic culture is really, I designed the book as a ripple effect. So you start at anything a company does starts with the actions of one individual. So really where you start at creating an empathetic company is you start at a person. What can that person do to be more empathetic and to lead with empathy? And then that ripples out to the internal culture of the organization. So whether you're a nonprofit, you're a for-profit, you're a social enterprise, I interviewed a variety of folks from all over the board on that in the book. What is that one person then doing to impact the larger internal culture so that everyone feels safe, feels heard, feels understood, and they can collaborate more effectively? And then the third one is really the external brand. So how is the company viewed through their community or their customers or their prospects or greater society? It's only then that can be authentic. If you've got the leadership and the culture levels behind it, that it's not just sort of a PR trick that you're mm-hmm. trying to do of like, look at us, we're empathetic. We give to the local food bank once a year. Like, that's great for us. And so I wanted to really dig deep and show that actually a lot of this stuff has to start from the inside.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what I'm hearing there is you're starting with the individual. How can they be empathic? And if you have, do you mean the leader or just all the individuals in a?
I'm using the term leader. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So any individual in an
mm-hmm.
organization, like the only thing you can change is yourself, right? The only thing you really can impact is you and your behavior and your actions to start. So whether you are a leader, you're the CEO of a, $100 billion company, or you're a entry level manager within an organization, and maybe you don't even have a team of people, maybe it's just you. It's actions that a person can take for themselves on how to strengthen their empathy muscle.
Okay, so you're looking at the individual, what they can do to become more empathic and
Exactly.
strengthen that muscle, and then it'll
Yes.
sort of ripple out throughout the culture and
Yes.
of the business.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we could start with the definition, how you're defining empathy. I've, as you know, there's people who define it differently, and there's sort of disagreement, especially among the academics. They're kind of, and I've talked to people like Dan Batson, who I think you had referenced to,
Mm-hmm.
and he says, he had laid out different ways that the word is used, and just saying that if you have a discussion, it's good just to be clear on how you're using the word and be sort of consistent. It's like there's not a right and wrong per se, but just know what. And so I see you had a section about what is, defining empathy. And I think you started by saying it's not sympathy. So you sort of
Mm-hmm.
compared sympathy and empathy as sort of a kind of start getting a little bit of understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how I define it for the purpose of the book, and exactly what you said, like there's so many different ways people use the word. The definition has changed over time. In the 1500s, it meant something closer to sympathy, for example. In the 1800s, it meant something else. So we can get all caught up in the semantics, and then that avoids the conversation of how we actually make ourselves more empathetic, right?
Mm-hmm.
So where my research led me was, and this is really what I think of it as, to be quite honest, and that makes sense for most people, is that empathy is perspective taking of another person, seeing things through their point of view. It's not being nice. It's not caving in to their demands. These are the things that make people not want to talk about empathy in the workplace. But so I'm very quick to say, it's not acquiescence. It's not just let's hire a bunch of really nice people and they'll do nice things and therefore we're empathetic. But it's about being able to take on another person's point of view, see things from their perspective. And the important part is to then act based on that information. So it's not so much an empathetic, it's not so much a thing you do or a thing you even feel. It is how you inform your decision making. So what is that perspective taking? What is that mindset you have? And then how does it inform the action you take? So the action you take could be seen as a compassionate action. That's where I see, where I found some definitions for compassion falling in, is that compassion has action attached to it. Empathy, again, is a mindset and a perspective, but you can have that mindset and perspective and do nothing with that information. So the compassion comes in when you act on it. And again, it's not about giving people what they want, but are you factoring in other points of view and understanding the person in front of you where they are before you take your action? Are you adjusting your action based on that person's point of view and experience? So I really see it as a perspective taking, info gathering mindset exercise. And that's something you can totally change about yourself. You can strengthen that empathy muscle so you start to see things from that perspective.
So the place where I start with empathy is sort of on the work of Carl Rogers. If you're familiar with his work, he used this empathic listening within the therapeutic realm, and I've been trying to bring it into the relational, with the focus, taking it out of the professionalism. Just like how
Right.
do we relate? You and I are relating here. How do we listen to each other? But in that process, or in his way, he would just listen to people and sort of be present with them. So hopefully I'm being empathic with you, I'm being present with you. I'm seeing your head nodding. I can feel your sort of understanding. When I sort of said something, you kind of laughed. I can feel the humor, with you that you were sensing or expressing. So I'm staying sort of present with you and kind of sort of sensing into who you are as a human being.
Right.
And so it's sort of like the word empathy itself is in feeling. So I'm sort of feeling into your experience and, just
Yeah.
with that presence.
And you landed on the number one individual practice, which is to practice presence. Because if we're not present, if we're too stuck in our own stuff, for example, about like how I feel or what I'm going to say or how I look to you or whatever, there's no room in my head to then now adopt your perspective and try to see things from your point of view. There's too much noise. So practicing presence is extremely important in even just beginning to take an empathetic mindset towards somebody else and being fully focused. And again, being able to listen well is important because again, if you don't listen well, that person's telling you their experience. If you can't listen and take that in, then, you know, it's not like you have to guess at what their perspective is if they're talking.
Yeah, they're sharing it with you.
They're sharing
you
it with
listen
you.
and you hear what it is that they're sharing.
Exactly. So I think sometimes for people that feel that they are not as empathetic, which, you know, that always kills me because science has shown humans are empathetic in their DNA. Like it's just some people have grown up in environments or in environments where it's that muscle is flexed more readily, just like going to the gym, right? And then other people haven't been to the gym in a while and they might be in a toxic environment or a dysfunctional family or whatever, and it's atrophied for them. But this excuse of, well, I'm just not naturally empathetic, that just doesn't come naturally for me. That's why you have to practice some of these things. Like no one naturally has washboard abs either, but you go to the gym and you get them, right? And so I think breaking these down, especially what I tried to do in the book was make things really actionable for people, and not be just there's excellent books out there about the theory of empathy. And that was not, I was trying to solve the problem of people feeling all this empathy in recent years, but not knowing what to do with it or how to impact the world by being more empathetic. Whether that's at work, whether that's differing political stances, whether it's, you know, neighbors that are not getting along, just being able to practice that mindset and empathy and put it into action. And what I try to break it out into those specific steps where, you know, for you, that's sort of that is empathy, is being present. For some people, they might not even make that connection, that's where it starts. And they might have to practice that behavior over and over again in their interactions before it becomes their default mode.
So you're wanting to make empathy sort of actionable and take it out of the theoretical. So take it out of the theoretical, how do we bring it into real human relationships? And then saying that that it's a practice, you exercise, you can strengthen sort of those neural networks to strengthen that empathic sort of way of being. And, you know, how do you do that? And how is sort of what I'm hearing.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think that one of the interesting things with any new habit, whether it's trying to be more empathetic, whether it's trying to eat better, whether it's trying to exercise, is at first it always feels forced because you're adopting a new behavior, you're adopting a new habit. So sometimes people get turned off by, well, you're giving me this script of like how to pretend to be empathetic. It's like, no, it's not how to pretend to be empathetic. It's about doing these things so you start to see someone's point of view, you start to see someone's perspective. And it's not going to be easy at first for some people. It is going to be hard. It is going to be difficult. It is going to feel forced, but that doesn't mean it's not guiding you to the behavior change you seek. And so I think we get confused on like, I either have it or I don't. Right. And that's the other thing I'm trying to do with this book is like, try some of these things on for size and see how, you know, and consistently, and see how it changes the quality of your interactions. See if your dysfunctional team at work actually starts to get along better. See if you're actually happier and calmer as a result. See if you're able to like get your projects approved because, you know, or you're able to help customers better because you are taking an empathetic mindset. Because as I spoke to a psychologist for the book, you know, when you are developing those new habits, they are rote at first. She works with autistic children. I think you heard me tell this story at the launch party you attended.
I was at your book launch party here in Berkeley.
Exactly. And, you know, she said, you know, they are rote checklists at first. They're not coming from a intrinsic motivational place. But what happens is their feedback from the world changes. And it, like you said, it changes those neural pathways and it moves they want to do more of it. And so the more they do, the more it becomes something they don't have to think about. And that's kind of where we want to get to. I mean, my crazy vision is that we don't have to write books about empathy anymore, because it'll be just part of our own internal identity and how we operate.
Well, it sounds like you want to put people at ease, saying that we are empathic and that you can learn these skills, and here are some ways of doing it.
Absolutely. And I know I practice them too, because I'm not, I tend to get very hot-headed about things and impatient. And, I've had my share of conflicts in the workplace and those experiences, but I'm, part of it is, it's been an exploration I've been on for a long part of my life, but also through what I've learned writing this book, is that I'm starting to just be more aware of those moments of when can I inject that, when do I need that grounding, for example? When do I need to take a step back and take a few breaths and stay present? When do I need to avoid distractions? When do I need to be a better listener? When do I need to find common ground? These are all like habits from the book. But, and I'm not perfect at it, and I make mistakes, and I get, like I said, impatient or hot-headed, but I think it's the attempt. I think about, okay, our entire world, if everyone made that attempt, and even if they failed sometimes, even if they missed some of those shots, I feel like it would be a better place.
So sort of having that intention, if we could have that intention, then, it's,
Exactly.
you're gonna come short, but then you can always come back to that intention, sort of move forward.
Exactly. And it makes sense to me to talk about this in a business context, because many of us spend 40 to 80 hours a week at work. And sometimes we're pretty awful people at work because we're miserable, because we don't feel understood or heard or listened to, for whatever reason. I don't know how we're going to expect society to deal with its empathy gap right now if we expect that all of a sudden we're going to change into a different person when we go home. Like, we should be using our workplaces as laboratories and sandboxes to practice some of these skills, because we're there most of the day. Sometimes we spend more time at work during the week than with our families. And so practicing it there will help it bleed over into our personal lives.
To have it in all parts of our lives too, not just in one area, and then you go put on your competition hat or whatever, or the anti-empathy hat. Well, it is, because this sense of empathy is rather subtle, that it's easy to kind of confuse it with other qualities or other senses. So if it's sort of still on the definition a little bit, is that feeling into, the sensing into, in hearing, listening someone. And I was hearing before, you were saying, well, there's things that block that. One thing is you might have your own stresses, right? You've got, and then you're kind of absorbed with your own worries, and that's sort of blocking your presence with someone else.
Of course.
And that was one of the sort of blocks I was hearing. Those are things you can overcome. And then there was, if you're feeling sympathy, the comparing empathy and sympathy, that instead of me being present with you, if I start feeling sorry for you, that could be about me, kind of shifting my awareness to me instead of being present with you. Like, oh, I feel so sorry for you, pity, that. So these are subtle sort of energies, and it's good to know, what is the energy that we're talking about? And I know you'd mentioned Paul Bloom in your book.
Yes.
And so I'm just wanting to be sure that when we, talk about these different qualities, that we know what we're describing. And what he's describing, I think you'd mentioned it too, you don't even really see it as empathy in a sense, in that he's saying that if I listen to you and you're very angry, then I become angry. He has sort of like state matching. He's calling that empathy. Or if you're, emotionally in a puddle crying, and then I start crying, and then, but that's actually more like state matching, or there's other identification. There's other terms for that.
I love that.
I wouldn't even call that empathy. So his criticism is not even of empathy for me. His criticism, he's criticizing things that are not empathy. And calling it empathy, it just creates this huge confusion. So
I think his book is really misunderstood. I mean, I think he even says it. He's like, of course I'm not against compassion. I'm not a heartless monster. But sometimes taking that empathetic mindset to the extreme where you're only seeing things from I think his point was, when you're only seeing things from that one person's point of view in front of you, and then you make decisions based on that, you actually could, because you're only basing it on one person, you could be harming the larger good, because you're not thinking logically. You're thinking, oh, I just want to help this person in front of me. And you're thinking very emotionally. And that's what I love about the modern definitions of empathy: break up empathy into emotional empathy and cognitive empathy. And I'm talking more about the cognitive empathy of taking another person's perspective. There are moments where appropriate, you might feel what that person is feeling. But how I see it differing from sympathy is that, and one of the experts I interviewed, who's also a business consultant, book had a great way that she spoke about this. And she said, sympathy is me standing in front of you and like basically being with you at this moment in time. Empathy helps me understand the journey that got you here. So sympathy is for that situation. I might, we often see sympathy as the negative context of, I feel sorry for you, I pity you. That's definitely not empathy, because that's about you and how you're viewing someone else's circumstance. One of the social entrepreneurs I interviewed for the book, Joy McBride, I think her name was, but she started a company called Fair Anita to help Peruvian artisans break the cycle of domestic violence, and by creating marketable goods and getting those to market. And it's since expanded to many, many other countries all over the world. But she said, in our marketing, we never pity our artisans. We never talk down to them as like, she's like, I would never tell someone to buy from my friend in Minnesota because she's broke and you really need to buy from her because she's in a really bad situation. She's like, that would be demeaning to her. So when we talk about the artisans, we look at it from their point of view. They're leaders in their community. They're trying to break the cycle. They're creating amazing accessories and jewelries and art and goods, and they have a strength there. So it's about never looking at them through a pity lens. And I think that's where I'm being empathetic because I feel sorry for you. That's not the same thing. I need to be empathetic and say, well, what do you need right now? And what's the journey that got you to this point? And I can see things from your point of view, and I can understand how this circumstance must be impacting you. I could almost imagine what it would be like. And that's where maybe the emotional empathy comes in, of like, I can imagine it. I have this issue of like, I can imagine it so viscerally. I start crying. I start getting stressed. I start, every time I see a lost dog poster, I have a dog. I love my dog. Right. And I've started crying sometimes just seeing a lost dog, because I start to imagine what that person must be going through. I imagine them putting the poster up, frantically looking for their, and that's not very, is that empathy? I don't know, because do I really understand where they're coming from? Can I give them what they need in that moment? Or am I too stuck in my own sympathy for that person? So it is kind of a blurred line, I think, and it can get tricky for people. I lost sound on you, actually. You're muted.
Somehow I hit the wrong button here. That's weird.
That's okay. I was like, I want to hear what he's saying.
Yeah. So it was a sense of loss, right? If you see the dog, you remember your own sense of loss, maybe, and then you think, oh, then you kind of go into that.
Right. But it doesn't mean that that is that person's way that they experience loss. I think that's the other thing to understand is when we're being sympathetic to people, we assume they're reacting the same way we would react. And that's where there is no empathy in that, because it's about seeing things from their point of view, and maybe they're not experiencing that situation the same way you are. So empathy requires that you ask questions and find out what's going on for them and how are they experiencing whatever this dramatic situation might be.
Yeah, the problem with the sympathy, I think, is that if you try solving problems from a purely sympathetic approach, you're sort of trying to solve your problem and not the other person's problem.
Exactly.
So that you hear all these, these NGOs, support for third world countries or whatever, where it's sort of trying to solve your own idea of what the problem is instead of being present and really sort of co-designing it being a relationship of, let's see how this works for you. And,
I love that. And that was the other thing that this woman, Joy, who started Farinita, she spent years just talking to these women in all these different countries, because she knew she didn't, even though she had been a survivor of abuse, she knew she needed to understand what they needed to be successful, not what she thought they needed, but what did they need to make change in their communities or make change in their own lives. She spent years before and adjusting and tweaking the business model. And that empathetic lens of information gathering is what made her successful.
Yeah, so that's the gateway of action based on sort of what the reality of the needs are of people, and how the addressing problems that really address their needs instead of your own needs per se.
And I come from a marketing discipline, so marketing is all about empathy. It's like what do our customers need? What do they want? What do they fear? What do they value? Not in the hopes of just convincing them no matter what that they need our solution, but finding those people who have those specific needs and want that specific solution. Now we can meet them where they are, and we can have a conversation with them that almost doesn't even feel like a sales conversation, because now you're having just a dialogue about, well, you have this need and I understand the pain points that you have, and here's how I think our solution can solve that for you. And maybe you don't need these parts of it. Maybe you only need these parts, or whatever item that you sell. But marketing is all about figuring out what's going to resonate for someone else. Effective marketing, I should say, because there's a lot of bad marketing out there.
It's addressing the needs and improving people's well-being, because you're really helping them, supporting them along their own experience, their own sort of journey.
Exactly. And that's why I always believe in marketing for good rather than evil. I constantly talk to clients, and when I talk on stage, it's about marketing is not about lying to people. Good marketing is not about lying to people. It's about empathizing with them, understanding where they are and what they need, and then elevating the truth of your story so that that person can find you, not lie to them, but just, and if that person doesn't need what you have, they're not your target audience. It's not about like trying to convince everybody, but, find those people who have the needs, see things from their point of view, and provide a solution.
Well, with, from reading how you were defining empathy, you talked about compassion. I do want to make a plug, because this relationship of empathy and compassion, in that often it's said, well, empathy is just feeling, sensing someone's or perspective taking, and compassion is action. And I want to say that I sort of disagree with that, in the sense that for me, empathy itself is immensely beneficial. So if there's people who are, if you have someone who's just feeling really good and you empathize with them, it's like they feel even better, because they've had a joy, and then they've been able to share their joys. And there's this saying, joys shared or joys doubled, sorrows shared or sorrows halved. So it's a sense that, but you have to be able to be sensitive and aware of the person's, visceral felt experience.
Yeah.
So that itself is, I think, is one of the most powerful benefits, of empathy itself, is being present with someone and them being heard. So you don't even have to do anything. You don't have to, give them money or whatever.
Right.
So I hear that a lot from like the compassion community. It's like, oh, we're doing action. Empathy is just this thing that is just, sensing something. It's neutral.
Well, I think that empathy can, in more likelihood, lead you to compassionate action. And like you said, in that scenario, the action is the listening. Like the empathy did result in the action of the act of listening. That's an active thing. It's a verb, right? So that caused an impact, right? And by the way, this was like not everywhere that I found that there was that definition, but in some camps I was like, okay, that kind of makes sense to me, of like empathy leading to a compassionate action. Because if the action, if you're acting on someone else, then it's an action. In your scenario, the act of listening alone was the compassionate action. The listening was empathetic because they were trying to hear that person's point of view. But at the end of the day, the action was still felt. And it wasn't just me alone in my room trying to imagine what you were going through and not reaching out to you, not calling you on the phone, not meeting you for coffee, just to take that scenario a step further. So I think in that situation, they're kind of entwined, because the very act of seeing things empathetically by doing what? By practicing active listening, created an action of compassion for that person that was being heard. So I think it's like a yes and, right? That more often than not leads to compassionate action. I think also what happens is, especially in the business context, they confuse compassionate with giving in. And you can be, one of my most empathetic bosses I ever had to lay off the entire marketing team. So the action itself was not what we wanted, but it was the way that he went about handling it that showed us that he saw things from our point of view, that he was empathetic, that he took whatever compassionate actions he could take, but the act of laying us off was not necessarily a compassionate action. So I like the idea of separating those things, because I think it gives people relief, or sort of it takes away their fear of, well, if I'm empathetic, that means I'm doing everything that everyone else wants me to do, and they're going to walk all over me. Right. And it's like, no, if you take that perspective and you have that mindset and you act accordingly with compassion, you can still, you might still have to do what you have to do, but it's the way that you do it. So I feel like it gives them permission that, oh, this doesn't mean I have to be a doormat. I can try to be empathetic. And sometimes that will lead to something very, compassionate, however they define it. And sometimes it might not, but the action that I do take is done in a way that's very compassionate. I know that's kind of convoluted, but
there's a lot there to unpack. And we could go on for quite a while, around that to sort of unpack, because there's sort of common understandings that that kind of definition comes a lot from the compassion community. And, we could go, there's a lot of different aspects of it. One is, a lot of times compassion is described as being specifically towards pain and suffering. So if you're not feeling pain, like I do freestyle dance, or used to, and it's like, it's all fun, and I'm being sensitive to the felt experience, the fun of others, and I'm relating to that fun. We're having mutual fun, and it's highly empathic, because you have to be highly attuned to each other. And so I can't say, oh, I'm being compassionate, because there's no pain and suffering involved. So, but I don't want to go too much, because that would be the other half an hour of the discussion. I like the point that you just made, that it's those definitions that cut people off from trying to do these things. And so I like what you said about compassion doesn't have to equate to easing someone's pain and suffering. For example, the very act of being empathetic and being present and listening is compassionate. So everybody wins, right? So I like that you said that it's not about pain and suffering, because it's not. And well, the thing I wanted to shift to was, we've talked about it a bit from a individual point of view, and I think what your chapter, the empathetic culture, is, it's about the relationship, right? It's not just one person being empathic. It's about that we're mutually empathic with each other. And I think that's what's creating the culture, right? Is that I'm sensitive to who you are, to your experience, and you're also sensitive to me, who I am. So there's this mutual sensitivity in creating a culture where people are mutually sensitive to each other's, visceral felt experience in life, is sort of how I'm seeing culture. So maybe, I don't know. Culture,
I mean more in terms of environment. So are you creating an environment that fosters empathetic thinking, that fosters empathy, and you can pull levers in an environment. You can reward empathy. You can have accountability structures. In the business context, you can hire people where you look at them and say, not only do they check all the boxes from a very transactional level on the job we have, but what are they like as a person? Are they an empathetic person? Do they collaborate well with others? and being able to hire those people into the organization. So you avoid this thing of like, well, let's just hire a bunch of really nice people and therefore we will have an empathetic culture. Not if the environment doesn't foster that. So are you, like I said, do you have reward structures? Is it part of their performance evaluations? Is it part of how people get promoted? Do you highlight people every month based on how they're of service to others or collaborating well with others or finding common ground, all those markers of empathy? And every organization defines empathy differently, but the point is they define it, right? So once you define it, you can put accountability and reward structures in place to reward it and to recognize it and to highlight it. What you don't want to do is build an organization that you say is empathetic, and all that means is it's a poster on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
So where put your money where your mouth is. Like, what are you doing? And there's examples of companies in the book that say kind of offshoots of empathy, but service and humility, and they reward it in a big way, and they publicly recognize it. So the culture knows that is what it gets rewarded. That's what gets recognized. And I want to do more of that because that's how I'm going to be successful here, versus an organization that rewards competition and secrecy and fear and all that kind of stuff. That's you get the culture you reward. That's what happens. And we'd like to say, well, as humans, we'd be able to better discern what the right thing to do is. And I hate saying right and wrong in that context because it's very judgmental. But one of the best quotes was from one of the sociologists back in the day. It said, well, this is why we have an income tax system. We can't just rely on people to be out of the goodness of their heart. They're going to help contribute to the communal what's needed. So we have a law, right? So same thing internally in a culture. What do you do that's actually creating the environment that rewards and tells people this is what's expected of them? Because you make it easy for people to default to empathy when you do that.
Mm-hmm.
Not that they necessarily wouldn't, and maybe they would be empathetic whether that environment had those structures or not. But man, it's a lot easier when you can give people just an easy way to fall into that default.
Yeah, because I mean, this is really interesting to me because, I've been looking at how do we create a global culture of empathy, right? You're looking at businesses, how do businesses, and I think it's totally scalable. Like
totally, any organization, right?
Yeah, exactly. We have the political organization in the United States, and it's highly dysfunctional, right? We got 50-50 split. There's competition. People aren't listening to each other. It leads to just this sort of dysfunction within the society. All these people upset, constantly railing, about. It's a very toxic, culture.
And this is why it's so important why the media plays a part in that. Because if they're elevating only the stories of competition and divisiveness, think about that in an organizational context, right?
Mm-hmm.
All the people in the organization that are competitive and cruel and indecisive get heard. Therefore, I need to be competitive and cruel and indecisive to get heard. What if the people that we're talking about unity, and I know this is a very simplistic way of looking at the world, but sometimes these things are simple.
Yeah.
What if the people that were promoting unity and collaboration and positivity were the ones that got airtime? Then the others would say, well, that's what I need to do to get airtime. But it's because we're rewarding, we as a culture, because media only gives people really what they want to hear sometimes, right? We're rewarding as a culture those people that are behaving badly with our attention, with our eyeballs. These reality TV shows that show people being super cruel to each other,
horrible.
Their ratings skyrocket.
Mm-hmm.
All of us can lament that, but I personally don't watch those shows because I don't want to support that as a example of success, right? Because the more that we do, the more other people are going to see that and say, that's what I need to do to succeed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if there's people who are doing it, they're getting the attention. It's
Exactly.
like, hey, I want attention. We all need attention. We all need to be seen. And this is, how they're going to kind of get that attention because they see other people are getting attention that way.
Yeah, exactly. And My husband was very empathetic and just brought me a latte.
Oh, nice. Cool.
But
we're casual here.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, he was like, oh, I know she's been on there for a while. So, but yeah, I mean, I really believe that. And again, I'm not perfect, and I've been the person that sometimes supports watching the train wreck, or, you know, tuning in or doing the clickbait or whatever. But especially when it comes to media, that's what's happening is just like in an internal organization, we as a society have operationalized horrible behavior because we've shown that that's how you get attention. And in a business organization, like the ones I highlighted in the book, they are trying to say, no, you know, we're going to reward and call out all this positive behavior. And that makes other people, it serves as a model that other people want to follow, because they know that's how I need to act to be successful here.
Mm-hmm. So it's like you were saying, the reward was attention.
Mm-hmm.
In the media. Is that
Mm-hmm.
what you mean, like in a business? Is like the
No,
people who, or what is the what is the sort of the reward?
Well, it could be
so
this is, you have to recognize and reward people based on what they want, what's important to them. Is it a pay raise? Is it a title promotion? Is it a extra week of paid vacation? Is it, you know, a plum assignment? Whatever it is for that person, and you know, it can take lots of different forms. It just doesn't have to take the form of money.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, are they being recognized at an all hands meeting or a company meeting to say, like, they've done a really good job and here's what they did? And a lot of the examples I talked about in the book, where I mentioned that it's in their performance evaluations, for example, they're not just performance evaluations based on, did you meet your quarterly goals, right? Did you generate the revenue? Did you get the product done on time? Did you blah, 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 blah. It's also, you know, how did you help coworkers this quarter? Like, when did you do something very heroic for your coworkers, that you were there for them in a time of personal crisis or whatever? There's lots of different ways you can sort of skin that onion. But it's important. I'm glad you brought that up, because it's important to also note that you have to be empathetic in terms of the rewards that you offer, and they have to be meaningful to the person that you're offering them. Because what might be meaningful for you as the boss, when I do something really good and you reward me that way, I might be like, I don't want that. Like, that's not meaningful for me. Right. So, it can take a lot of different forms.
Yes, you have to empathize with what people's needs are and what's meaningful for as a quality of empathy in that. And so,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's challenge like this, you know, how to shift the culture, you know, because I keep looking at the larger culture in the country, in the United States, and that, you know, we do this thing with the empathy tent, which I think you mentioned, you saw. We offer listening to the public, and we go to these rallies where the political left and right are sort of battling it out. We offer listening to both sides. And it was actually put into a documentary that's coming out called Trump Phobia, What Both Sides Fear.
That's great.
So you can Google that. There's a trailer for it, and it shows us doing mediation between the sides.
Nice.
So I'm thinking that we need to take our empathy tents onto the Capitol Mall. And set up there and demand that the Republicans and Democrats do empathy circles with each other, which is one of the practices one of the most empathic practices that I know of, is kind of mutual active listening.
Right.
And so that kind of comes a bit into power structure, right? It's like, I've been saying for a long time, yeah, we need more empathic society. You know, hardly anybody listens.
Right.
Right. It's like, and it's a bit like nonviolent direct action of Kingian nonviolence. Is like, how do you shift the power structures, right? It's like, it wasn't until the lunch counter sit-ins or the freedom rides that something dramatic kind of had to happen to shift the culture. So I guess maybe, I don't know what I'm getting at. Maybe it's the relationship of power and empathy, you know, or even in a company, there's power relationships. And just how, you know, how do you see those power relationships and empathy?
It's an interesting question, because to your point, you know, these platitudes of just, we need to be more empathetic, that doesn't give people a roadmap, right? And that, again, that's why I wrote the book, because it was about what are the actions we can take that, again, might feel forced at first, but what are some actions we can take? Getting into an empathy circle is a great action somebody can take, right? Even if they're sitting there like this at the first 10 minutes or whatever. But you're absolutely right. And that's why I think being able to have leaders that have this servant leadership mindset. Again, if they're leading these organizations, they're showing that this is what we expect of all the people within our organizations. Like, we're not taking shortcuts. You can't take shortcuts, right? And they're showing that that's how we do things around here. And I know that that requires that we try to fill society and these organizations with the most empathetic people possible. We can't do that in one fell swoop. And so what's really hopeful for me is at the end of the book, I talked about a lot of people all over the world that are working in these individual pockets of helping the younger generations, the future leaders, make empathy a default mode for themselves, make it a part of their identity of how they see the world, how they process the world, and how they interact with each other. Because short of just trying to change everybody that's in leadership now, it's not totally a lost cause, because obviously my book is targeted to those leaders and the ones that are receptive to it. And that's why I wrote the book from a very, some people might say, very cynical angle of like gathering the data and the research that shows why this is good for business. Because I'm just trying to reach people where they are.
Right.
And if they pick up this book saying, I want my company to be more profitable and I want to hold on to my top talent, I'm going to look at this book and see what I need to do to be empathetic, right? I'm okay with that, because at least they're taking the journey. And yes, sometimes you have to tell people to do something for selfish reasons to get them on board, right? I sometimes have to play games with vegetables to get them down my 6-year-old's throat, right? But at the end, he's eating his vegetables. So sometimes I think what happens is, as a society, these factions, we get too caught up in, you're wrong because you're not being empathetic, right? Or you're wrong because you're not being compassionate. And that doesn't do anyone any good. So again, like, think like a marketer. What's the thing that's going to compel them? What's the need that they have that we need to be speaking to at least start engaging them in this conversation? In this case, obviously I have a larger purpose, as we've talked about, but I'm just trying to say, okay, fine. You just want to make your company more profitable and get more press and do all this stuff. Read this book. I'm just trying to get them on board by speaking to their selfish motives initially, because I have seen that taking this mindset and performing these rote acts for whatever your initial intention can actually transform you from the outside in. So I want them to taste their vegetable, right? I want them to just try it on and see how it feels. And
what I'm hearing there is you're making the case for empathy and saying, here's the benefits. And I think you have a whole section on the benefits
for each one,
of empathetic culture. And it's like, here's the benefits. Here's how you will benefit personally from that. And so you kind of make the case, and then people say, oh, I want some of that. So maybe, and I want my vegetables.
Exactly.
They're good for me because I'm gonna be strong and healthy or something.
And we see some movements kind of taking a page from that playbook in terms of, like, for example, people have been wanting us to invest, the US, for example, I'm not sure if you have a global audience, but the US, for example, to invest more into education for all, equal access to education. And when people try to do the morality thing, the ethical thing about, like, well, this is just the right thing to do, and you're an awful person if you want to deny people education, that's just going to push someone further away, right? But you start to hear the argument of, like, the US is not going to be competitive in the world market anymore if we don't shore up our education system. That gets some people's attention. Like, oh, now I have something to lose, right? So now maybe I need to get on board with this. And I'm dissecting that argument in a very pedantic way, but I know there's a lot more finesse to it. But my point is starting to look at things in terms of, like, how it can benefit the person that's fighting against you to bring them on side. Where can you find that common ground? So now you can at least have a dialogue together and you can go after a common goal. And maybe their reason for going after the goal is different than your reason, but you're both going after the goal.
Well, what I was hearing there is that, how do we create a more empathic culture is the first, you can't just say, just do this.
Just be more empathetic, right?
Just be more, and that's exhorting, I guess, exhortation doesn't work very well.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was hearing judgment doesn't work either. You're a bad
Mm-hmm.
person if you don't do this. So judgment
Right.
doesn't work. And that the way you can sort of lay out the benefits
Mm-hmm.
and then sort of address what people's needs are and how these benefits work as a
Right.
way to move forward in this.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of the things I was really excited about talking to you, coming from a marketing point of view, is I
Mm-hmm.
see that's what the value of empathy needs, that marketing mindset. Like
Right.
the practicality of how do we bring this into the culture, right? It's like, what is it that will entice people into it?
Exactly.
So I think we need more
Right.
marketing people to work on this marketing of empathy as a social
Well,
cultural value.
and like I said, that's often seen very skeptically because it's like, well, marketing is lying. Like we're the antithesis of that. And it's like, well, no, marketing is about communication. Like it's about compelling people to take an action, not always an evil action. Sometimes it's nonprofits engage in marketing. I've actually consulted with a few nonprofits on how to increase their donor base and how to impact more people. And you can use it for good, right? You can use it to compel people. And it's not about just, well, here's the cause, or here's the moral stand I'm taking, and you should either like it or you don't, right? That's a very judgy,
Mm-hmm.
elitist way of looking at it, right? So, okay, let's have a conversation. Like, what's in it for you? I talk about in the book, especially about empathetic cultures, how the younger generations of incoming talent are among some of the most diverse generations in history and among some of the most empathetic, according to certain studies. And they're used to an environment where everyone has a voice, and they're, again, the most diverse generations entering the workforce. So they're used to harnessing that diversity of thought in order to have a great outcome. So now they're coming into the workplace and they're demanding these internal cultures in the workplace. They're demanding things that we never demanded when we were entering the workforce. We just were thankful we had a job and good paycheck, and how were the benefits, and well, work's always supposed to be a grind and whatever. But they're saying no, if you want me to just kill it for you and just perform so well and help your company be more innovative and market leading and creative and sustainable, these are my conditions. And it's not even, this is what I mean about what's in it for the companies to change. If they don't, they are not going to attract the top innovative talent, and they will die. There's nothing more beneficial to talk about benefit for somebody than say you won't survive if you don't make this change.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I love that there's now this imperative for them to pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they initially didn't want to do it because it was, quite frankly, a good thing to do, to humanize the workforce and humanize the workplace, and treat everybody with respect. That's a novel idea, but ultimately they're going to have to.
So don't not make it necessarily from a moral position, but because if you create this empathic society, you'll be able to attract younger workers because they're sort of demanding this, and that these are the companies that they're going to stay with.
Yeah. And the top talent, if you want the top pick of the talent, they're going to have their pick of where they can go. And so if you want to continue to be innovative in the market and you want to attract them and you want to retain them, not just attract them, but make them stay, then these are things you're going to have to do. You're going to have this conversation, which is exciting to me. I'm excited that they're doing this, and this is what makes me very hopeful.
Well, there is a study I'd heard of by Google. They were looking at what makes good teams.
Yep.
And I think it was essentially an empathic environment where everyone is heard, that there's not one person sort of dominating, sort of there's a sharing of attention, of space to speak. I don't know if you're familiar with that study or if.
Well, I cited 2 Google studies in the book, and one, I always get the names mixed up. One of them was Project Aristotle. The other was Project Oxygen, but regardless of which one was which, one of them studied where Google's most inventive and productive products came from, what was the makeup of the people on those teams. And they had always thought that only those who were highly skilled technically could bring forth innovation. They had to be technologists, they had to be computer scientists, yada, yada, yada. And they found that of their most inventive and productive projects brought to market were made up of teams that exhibited more empathy, collaboration, and better communication than those that were purely more excellent from a technical level. In parallel to that, the other study they did was about looking at who succeeded at what types of people succeed at Google. So they reviewed all the hiring, firing, promotion data from their inception. And once again, found something similar, that it was not necessarily, I think they kind of said it very condescendingly, but it wasn't necessarily the A-team players that were the ones that succeeded. It was the ones that were more highly skilled at collaboration. Obviously, they had to be proficient at what they did. It wasn't like, this was the only thing that propelled them in their careers. But things like empathy, collaboration, the ability to communicate, all of those things were indicative of those that did the best at the company.
And that takes empathy into creativity and innovation, right?
Yes,
that
which
if you're very sensitive to the felt experience, you're able to go deeply into each other's, sensitivity of the experience and feelings and, perspectives, that you are more creative in that sense, because you're designing solutions that really address someone's real needs. And that takes this whole discussion into human-centered design, with the out of IDEO and the D School at Stanford, where they really put empathy as a core component to the whole design thinking mindset. And that seems like a huge benefit for any company that wants to be innovative and creative.
I mean, the data is there, and I showed in the book about how innovation boosts, or empathetic organizations have higher innovation, higher creativity, in some cases higher stock price. And my theory on the innovation and creativity part of it is part of, I think, partially what you said, which is about being more in tune and thinking of solutions outside of your own experience, right? It's sort of like your a pool of possibility is larger because you're able to not only think about your own experience or view of the world.
Field dependent thinking, that your field of that's actually an IDEO paper.
Yes. Okay.
Your field of awareness is much broader.
Right.
So you're creating in this larger field.
But I think there's a flip side to that too, in that the reason you have such high innovation and high collaboration in these organizations that have, highly empathetic cultures is because people aren't operating in fear. They're not watching their backs. Their minds are free and open to create, to innovate, to think about the job at hand, versus just like, oh, I don't want to do this because I might get fired, and I don't want to say this to this person. And, they're protecting their turf, and there's so many other things going on for them except innovation.
Yeah.
So when you can relax and you're in an environment where you have the freedom, you feel seen, heard, understood, you have less worry, you have less tension, at least in the work environment, right? Who knows what's going on for you at home, but
you need cultures of empathy at home too.
Exactly,
it's not like, it's not just in the work, it's like bring it home.
You're totally right about that. Like, think about that person who almost has the perfect life, right? Like they're surrounded by empathetic people in their personal lives, and they're surrounded by empathy at work. Like, what is that person going to be capable of creating?
And if we can do it for the whole culture, the political culture, I think, which is, I think, where you're trying to go too. So I don't want to overkeep you. We've gone for about an hour. I know we said it. I could talk for hours about this, and just the richness, talking with someone else who's just passionate about the value of empathy and has thought about it a lot. It's just such a real pleasure to talk to you. I don't know if you have anything you want to say just in closing.
No, I kind of, to reiterate, echo something I said earlier, it's this idea of trying to change the world to be more empathetic is really overwhelming and really daunting. So let's take a chunk out of this and just start where we spend the bulk of our time, which is at work. And we all have a difficult coworker, maybe a dysfunctional team. Make that your playground and your laboratory to start being, it's trite, but be the change you want to see in the world.
And if you need support, contact you.
Yes, please buy the book, share it with your friends. The more we can open up this conversation. And please, if you get the book, please leave a review on Amazon, because those really help. So thank you. An honest review, whatever you think.
Okay, thank you, Maria.
Thank you so much, Edwin.